Here's an article of Vice.com entitled Russia's Dyatlov Pass Incident, the strangest unsolved mystery of the last century. And it's written by Derek Mead. And Mr. Mead begins. On the surface, what's become known as the Dyatlov Pass Incident seems fairly explicable. Of a party of 10 skiers, 9 perished in the middle of a high-difficulty trek in conditions that reached negative 30 degrees Celsius. But the details, based mostly on diaries of those involved, as well as records from Soviet investigators, are chilling. On the night of February 2nd, 1959, members of the party apparently ripped their tent open from the inside, wandered into the tundra wearing nothing but what they wore to bed. 3 weeks later, 5 bodies were found, some hundreds of meters downslope from the original camp. It took 2 more months for investigators to find the other 4 bodies, which, curiously, were partially clothed in articles belonging to the earlier discovered dead. Tests of those clothes found high levels of radiation. Despite that, and heavy internal trauma, including fractured skulls and broken ribs, suffered by the then surviving members of the party, Russian investigators reported they could find no evidence of foul play, and they quickly shut the case. The group was made up of students and graduates of the Ural State Technical University, all of whom were experienced in backcountry expeditions. The trip, organized by 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, was meant to explore the slopes of Ural Mountain in the northern part of the Ural Range, and started on January the 28th. Yuri Yudin, the only member of the expedition to survive, got sick before the crew made it fully into the backcountry, and he stayed behind at a village. The other 9 trekked on, and according to photographs developed from rolls recovered by investigators, Dyatlov's crew set up camp in the early evening on the slopes of a mountain next to Orton. That mountain is known to the local indigenous Mansi tribes as Kholat Sikal, which translates to Mountain of the Dead. Still, the decision to camp on the mountain slope makes little sense. The group was reportedly only about a mile from the tree line, where they could have found at least a bit of more shelter in the sub-zero conditions. They didn't appear to be strapped for time, and setting up camp on the face of a mountain rather than within a nearby forest is questionable, although not indefensible. Yudin told St. Petersburg Times in 2008, it's in there somewhere, Dyatlov probably did not want to lose the distance they had covered, or he decided to practice camping on a mountain slope. That camp would be the group's last. Dyatlov had previously said that the team expected to be back in contact on February 12th, but also said the group might take longer than expected. It wasn't until around the 20th that the alarm was raised, and by the 26th, the camp had been found by volunteer search and rescue teams. When official investigators arrived, they noted the tents appeared cut apart from within, or the tent. It says here plural tents. There was only one tent. They noted that the tent appeared cut apart from within, and they found footprints from 8 or 9 people leaving the tents and heading off downslope in the direction of the tree line. According to investigators, the group's shoes and gear were left behind, and the footprints suggested some people were barefoot or wearing nothing but socks. In other words, they all shredded their way out of their tent and ran through the waist-deep snow in a big hurry. despite there being no evidence of other people or foul play within the group. The first two bodies were found at the tree line, under a giant pine. Remember that the tree line was about a mile away. Investigators wrote that footprints disappeared about a third of the way there, probably due to weather in the 3 weeks it took for them to arrive. The two bodies were found both wearing only their underwear, and both were barefoot. According to reports, branches were broken high up in the pine tree, which suggested someone had tried to climb it or get the wood from it. The remains of a fire lay nearby. 3 more bodies, including Dyatlov's, were found at points in between the camp and the big tree, and apparently lay as if they were headed back to camp. One of them, Rustam Slobodin, had a fractured skull, although doctors declared it non-fatal. And the criminal investigation was closed after doctors ruled the 5 had died of hypothermia. 2 months passed until the remaining 4 bodies were found buried under a dozen feet of snow in a gully a few hundred feet downslope from the big tree. The inexplicable behavior of the prior 5 members of the party aside, it was the discovery of this quartet that was the most horrific. All 4 suffered traumatic deaths, despite there being no outward appearance of trauma. One of them, Nicholas Thibault Brignolel, also had a fractured skull. Alexander Zolotaryov was found with crushed ribs. Ludmila Dubinina also had broken ribs and was also missing her tongue. It is possible that the group was searching for help, despite being essentially in the middle of nowhere, while missing gear in sub-zero temperatures before they fell into a ravine, but that does not explain Dubinina's missing tongue. And while some at the time posited that the group had been attacked by Mansi tribesmen, the local natives, coroners at the time stated that the trauma found required more force than humans could inflict, especially considering there wasn't accompanying outward trauma. Boris Vozrozdeny, one of the doctors on the case, said it was equal to the effect of a car crash. The author continues, it gets weirder. The final 4 found were better outfitted than the other 5 and apparently had taken clothes off the dead as they continued their trek. Zolotaryov, for example, was found wearing Dubinina's coat and hat, while she in turn had wrapped around her foot a piece of the wool pants that one of the 2 found at the pine tree had been wearing. To add to the mystery, the clothes found on the final group were tested and found to be radioactive. The radioactivity is hard to explain, but the rest of the case does have an explanation that's more plausible than aliens and nuclear experiments, which many people like to tie into the story. Paradoxical undressing is a reported phenomenon in those suffering from hypothermia, as is delirium. The most likely explanation for the disaster is that the team's camp was buried in an avalanche, which would explain the cutout tent and some of the trauma. Should the team have been buried for any amount of time, hypothermia was likely to set in, which would go a long way towards explaining why they set off in search of help without any gear at all. Again, with 5 members of the team listed as having died of exposure, this scenario is the most possible. But the radioactivity found is truly odd, as was the treatment of the investigation itself. Documents related to the case were sealed after it was closed, and were not opened until sometime in the 90s. The author writes, "I've been interested in this case for a while now, and have tried to dig up new information, but my freedom of information requests to various U.S. intelligence agencies have all turned up bupkis. The cause of the incident is still speculative, but interviews given by the lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, around the time the records were unsealed, shine light on just how strange the case is. Ivanov was one of the first who noticed that the bodies and gear found were all radioactive. And he said that a Geiger counter he had brought with him went nuts all around the campsite. He also said that Soviet officials told him at the time to clamp the case shut, despite reports that bright flying spheres had been reported in the area in February and the following month. Ivanov told the newspaper Leninsky Put in an interview dug up by the Times, quote, "I suspected at the time, and I am almost sure now, that these bright flying spheres had a direct connection to the group's death." End quote. Another group of students camped out around 30 miles. They reported similar sightings at that time. Around 30 miles from the Dyatlov group. In written testimony, one said that he saw, quote, "a shining circular body fly over the village from southwest to northeast. The shining disk was practically the size of a full moon. A blue-white light surrounded by a blue halo. The halo brightly flashed like flashes of distant lightning. When the luminous body disappeared behind the horizon, the sky lit up in that place for a few more minutes." The leading theory, considering the secrecy, the radioactivity, and the appearance of some of the bodies, which were reported as being deeply tanned by a young boy attending some of their funerals, is that the group somehow came across a Soviet military testing ground. But assuming the reports are true, what caused the trauma to some members of the group is unknown. It's possible that one of the members saw some crazy light in the sky, and everyone freaked out, running for their lives. Hello, Blue Cruz. But there's never been evidence of an explosion in the area, ruling out some sort of nuclear test or something of the like. But even so, that doesn't explain the skull fractures. Some could be explained by a fall into the ravine, but remember, Slobodin had a fractured skull and was found on his return to the camp. Was found to be. The fact that remains of a fire were found suggests some members of the group had control of their mental faculties, and psychosis is not a reported effect of acute exposure to radiation. But that doesn't explain why the group appeared to have run for their lives without bringing any of their gear. So was it an accident or a cover-up? The simple story is probably best. The team was buried in an avalanche, and in a state of hypothermia-induced delirium, rushed off in search of help. Avalanches are incredibly powerful, and being caught in one could likely result in the types of blunt trauma some of the group received. Still, the lack of closure from the original investigation has left the incident a favorite target of conspiracy theorists and alien hunters. And it is really a pretty weird tale. The investigator Ivanov has since passed away, and unless more military records are discovered and unsealed, which some advocates still call for, the records on hand are not enough to prove otherwise. and the mystery of what's now known as the Dyatlov Pass is likely to endure.